Hi, thanks very much. I very much appreciate the welcome, and I am delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the last speaker because he and those in the audience have beautifully set up this next talk. It's my privilege today to talk to you about cybersecurity in the quantum age. And I'm going to begin by a question that is on many people's minds, especially judging by what I saw in the last presentation. Is quantum a threat? And so bottom line up front, I am also very enthusiastic about the possibilities and the potential of quantum, and I believe that we're going to do some great things globally. There are some questions here, and those of you who have been following quantum might have heard either of two different statements, or perhaps even both, and possibly in the same environment. First, you might have heard quantum will break every piece of computer security or every piece of information system that we've got out there. Second is that quantum is the solution. And as is so often the case, neither of those things are exactly true. And this is the perfect time to be having the discussion. Whenever you're discussing security, privacy, or the ability to keep things working in a safe manner, the best time to have that dialogue is early on. And this is very early on in the quantum field. So it's a great time for us to be having this discussion. So what I'm going to do today is to give you at a high level those themes that I think that you should keep an eye on in the quantum space, and give some suggestions for those of you who are doing development, who are thinking about making purchases, or who perhaps are running live infrastructure, so that you'll have a sense of what should be considered going forward. So first, I want to talk about the question that has most people worried, and that is, how exactly might quantum break the internet? How might quantum be an issue for our critical infrastructure, and what should we do about it? In order to have that discussion, I do need to dive somewhat into how do we protect our critical infrastructure today, and what in fact we mean by critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure with a lowercase c could be anything you rely upon. Usually we think of the energy infrastructures, the transportation infrastructures, what we're doing with communication infrastructures, banking infrastructures, and some of the infrastructures that support government in other places, where it's really key that we be able to understand who is issuing a command or issuing a directive, or who has sent an email, and perhaps where a content needs to be protected for lengthy periods of time. Some organizations have to protect their information for up to 25 years, and so they have a little different requirement than those of us that are looking to protect information for perhaps a week or a year or 5 years. So critical infrastructure protection is what people are mostly concerned about when they talk about quantum being an issue. And so let me back you up a little bit to help you understand why that might be the case. When people are worried about our critical infrastructures and quantum breaking it, what they're usually thinking about is something like this. It is, what would happen if we had a sufficiently large quantum computer to run Shor's algorithm, which you just heard about from the last speaker, for a large enough key that it could be able to disrupt what's going on in these critical infrastructures. And how might that happen? Well, first I have to explain to you a little bit about, and I'll keep it very short. It is one of my pet subjects, but I will keep this very short. But public key is what we think about when we think about the underpinnings of the security in the context of Shor's algorithm. Public key is a method of encrypting data. You have two different keys. One is kept public for others to use, and other is private, available just for one individual or one device to use. So for instance, I would have a public key and a private key. That what I would do if I wanted to encrypt data and send it to someone securely, I might encrypt that data with their public key. That could only be decrypted by their private key. And if they're wanting to send it back to me, the data encrypted with their private key could only be decrypted with the public key. So depending on which direction we're going, I might use either one. Obviously, if somebody's wanting to send something to me, I would need to have a copy of their public key if they've encrypted it with their private key. And so why is that a problem? I want to show you a picture that will help you get a feel for what people worry about when they worry about encryption and timing on public infrastructure. And I'm skipping ahead to this slide because you have heard a bit about Shor's algorithm. Take a look at that line on the top. Now, I don't want you to worry about the number of operations across the left-hand side and the number of digits across the bottom. Those things will change based on speed of computer, on the kind of algorithm you use, and so on. But currently, when we think about securing our critical infrastructures in that public-private key pair, the reason that that's considered secure is that if I have someone's public key, I cannot easily find their private key. So I can't easily masquerade as them. But what if I were able to guess that private key based on knowing something about the public key? Well, there are many different algorithms for doing this. You see a piece of one here, number field sieve at the top, and Shor's algorithm underneath. And you see a big difference in the total number of operations that it's required, which has to do with the speed and the time it takes to do a decryption between the two of those. Shor's algorithm run on a quantum computer is exponentially faster than the best classical algorithms that we know that are run straight on a classical computer. And so we might have a key size that makes a communication perfectly secure for any of the threats that we're worried about against it currently. But if we were able to get access to a sufficiently large quantum computer and run Shor's algorithm on it, we might much more easily be able to break it. And that, in a nutshell, is why people are worried about the critical infrastructures. What happens if we get a sufficiently large quantum computer that can break encryption? So should we worry now? Well, no. At the moment, in one sense, no and yes. So in terms of, are there large enough quantum computers out at the moment that you need to worry very much about the data that exists today being broken on those? The answer is no. When people are talking about doing encryptions or factoring on those quantum computers that we have today, they're really talking about very, very small numbers, nothing like what we would use in a modern system. What they're concerned about is the future. Now, when we think about the future, though, having a hybrid mix of classical computers and quantum computers, there actually is a need for urgency and to think about where we might need to make changes. And so this is where everybody on the call on this web discussion really needs to be thinking through what infrastructures they access and which they have control over. Because if you think through how long it took us to get the current public key infrastructure, it's getting on for 2 decades. And when we talk about how long it might be before we get a sufficiently large quantum computer, NIST in the United States government, NIST references perhaps as early as 20 years from now, plus or minus 5 or 10, it still means a long, it is not really as far off as one might think that a person might need to worry about the ability to decrypt broadly with a quantum computer. And so what's going on? Well, Shor's algorithm has been known for a very long time. So it isn't as though people have been not thinking about what the next steps might be. So there have been many researchers thinking about different kinds of algorithms that both would be secure against something like a Shor's algorithm or another algorithm run on a quantum computer, and all the classical attacks that one might have. Because remember, we can never, ever forget that attacks never go away. We just simply add new attack surface in a hybrid system with both quantum and classical. And so because of that, there have been many different kinds of algorithms that have been proposed. And there's been a lot of work done to see which ones of those might be the most feasible. The one that I tend to point people to, because I am based in the United States, is the one that is being held by US NIST. So US NIST has been working for several years now to have an open competition, first gathering algorithms that might be good replacements, and then identifying what might be weaknesses in those and putting them out for both private and public conversation so that everybody can put eyes on those algorithms and look for weaknesses. It is not easy to find weaknesses in encryption algorithms, so you need to be very careful about rolling your own independently. It's really important to have an algorithm that many people have scrutinized, as well as to make sure that it's implemented correctly, whether you're talking hardware or software, and that it has a sufficiently large key. So that process is going on. NIST has entered last summer the third round of an examination of candidate algorithms. So that is something to take a look at. If you are thinking about launching a new update of your hardware or software that uses encryption, do think about using that as an opportunity to take a look at what NIST is producing and make that upgrade at the same time. So you can do it in a relatively painless way now when we don't have those sufficiently large quantum computers to worry about, but so that you will be prepared. Those that have to pay the most attention are those, of course, that are putting their algorithms into hardware. If you're working in a hardware embedded encryption algorithm, you need to think about what it would cost and what the replacement timing would be if you're not able to access a quantum resistant algorithm when you work with that particular kind of device, if it's going to be in the environment for so long. Now, there are other things that people think about when they talk about quantum and security, and they're not all worried about what might happen in terms of the breaking of the internet. There are many that are thinking of ways we could make security even better. And I'll start with one that seems along the nearest term. There are many researchers who are looking at, could we take advantage of quantum to have better randomness? Randomness, exploiting non-actual randomness or patterned randomness or randomness that is not true comes from the digital base. And there's a lot of speculation that using physics, especially quantum physics, we might be able to generate better random numbers that would be good as seeds for today's encryption algorithms. And so that's something to look at for those that are interested in an update that might be ready relatively soon. A second thing that people are looking at starts to get at the spookier qualities of quantum, which I think you've been hearing about in this series. And I'm just going to quickly hit a few of those so that there's time for questions. First, when we talk in this area, we're talking about quantum communication. And the idea here is that you want to have continental scale, eventually, quantum networks for ultra-precise sensing and distributed quantum computing, but also you can take advantage of having those quantum networks in order to be able to deliver your messages in a more secure manner. Now, there are a couple different things that people talk about when they think about using this kind of technology. One of them, and I won't say simple, but I will say the one that's seeing the most scrutiny now in terms of external investment, is something that takes advantage of the fragility of the qubit. So as you know, if you take a look at a qubit, it essentially devolves and it turns into either a 0 or 1. So essentially, a qubit gives us something that can be tamper resistant. And so if we are transmitting qubit quantum information in a quantum state, qubits, over fiber next to our traditional message, we can actually take advantage of that hybrid and take a look at whether or not someone's tampered with the qubit, and that might let us know more about what tampering has happened in the package altogether. A really great example of how that's being used is quantum key distribution. This, again, I would consider fairly early stage, although there's hardware out there. One needs to be very cautious about adopting new hardware and all of the associated infrastructure that comes with it. But with quantum key distribution, you can use a smaller channel that's quantum-based across your fiber to distribute your keys. That still leaves you with a vulnerability of the algorithm, but you at least start with a good key. Something that's a little more advanced and sounds a little spookier, but could have great potential, is quantum teleportation. So another thing that one could do is take advantage of entangling pairs of photons. If we use the classical example of Alice and Bob communicating, and we take our entangled pair of photons and send one to Alice and one to Bob, and Alice lets her entangled qubit interact with some data, Bob's will change instantaneously. Not speed of light, but instantaneously, and in a way that can't be tampered with. So those are two of the ways people are talking about using quantum in order to improve communication. You've heard about encryption as something we need to think about in terms of identifying where changes need to be made. And with that, I will stop.